Sometimes the most profound promises are made by the smallest hearts. In a world where children's dreams are often dismissed as fantasy, one little girl's bold declaration would change the course of an empire. When 10-year-old Lydia approached the mighty Emperor Severan amid the chaos of war, she spoke words that stunned everyone present. While his court laughed at her innocent proclamation of love, the emperor saw something different in her eyes. He knelt down and gave her a promise that would bind their fates forever. Years later, she returned as a woman, but would he remember the child who had captured his heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Rome, like memories refusing to fade. Emperor Marcus Aurelius Severan stood at the marble balustrade of his private chambers, watching the city awaken beneath him. At 53, his once dark hair had turned silver at the temples, and lines of responsibility etched deep around his eyes spoke of decades bearing the weight of an empire. The purple cloak of his office hung heavy on shoulders that had carried both triumph and loss through countless campaigns. Below, the Forum Romanum stirred to life. Merchants called their wares, children laughed as they chased each other between the columns, and the eternal rhythm of Rome continued as it had for centuries. Yet something felt different this morning, a tension in the air that made his weathered hands grip the cool marble tighter. "Caesar," came a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Gaius Lucianus, his most trusted advisor, approaching with measured steps. The older man's face bore the careful neutrality that had served him well in the treacherous waters of imperial politics. But Marcus could read the concern in his friend's dark eyes. "The reports from the eastern provinces have arrived," Gaius continued, extending a sealed scroll bearing the eagle insignia. "The situation in Antioch grows more troublesome by the day." Marcus accepted the document, but did not immediately break the seal. Instead, he studied his advisor's face, reading the unspoken words that protocol prevented him from voicing openly. How troublesome? "The governor writes of unrest among the people. Trade routes disrupted. Tax collection complicated." Gaius chose his words carefully, as court etiquette demanded. But Marcus heard the underlying message clearly enough. "Rebellion," Marcus said simply, not a question but a statement of fact. He had seen it before, the subtle signs that preceded open revolt. A restless populace, disrupted commerce, and governors who suddenly found their authority questioned at every turn. The emperor broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, his experienced eyes scanning the formal language that attempted to mask the severity of the crisis. Governor Quintus Fabius Maximus had written with the measured tone of a career politician, but between the lines, Marcus read desperation. The eastern provinces, vital to Rome's grain supply and trade networks, teetered on the edge of chaos. "How many legions can we muster?" Marcus asked, already calculating logistics in his mind. A lifetime of military command had taught him to think first of practical solutions rather than dwelling on problems. "The 10th Legion remains stationed near the capital," Gaius replied. "The 5th and 12th could be recalled from the Germanic territories within a month. But Caesar, perhaps diplomacy might serve where force would prove costly." Marcus held up a hand, silencing his advisor's well-intentioned counsel. Gaius meant well, but he had never led men into battle, never felt the weight of command when lives hung in the balance. Sometimes, the emperor knew, strength was the only language that warring factions understood. "Prepare my traveling retinue," Marcus commanded. "We leave for Antioch within the week." Caesar, surely sending a legate would suffice. No. The single word carried the finality of imperial decree. The people need to see their emperor. They need to understand that Rome's authority comes not from distant scrolls, but from the presence of Caesar himself. As Gaius bowed and departed to arrange the necessary preparations, Marcus returned his gaze to the city below. Somewhere in those twisting streets, life continued its ancient dance. Fathers taught their sons trades passed down through generations. Mothers sang lullabies that had soothed Roman children for centuries. Young lovers met in secret gardens, whispering promises they believed would last forever. The emperor envied them their simple certainties. Love, family, the comfort of knowing one's place in the world. These were luxuries that kingship had long denied him. His marriage to Claudia Augusta had been a political alliance, producing no children and little warmth. She had died 3 winters past, leaving him with memories of polite conversations and dutiful public appearances, but no true companionship. A knock at the chamber door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, not turning from the balcony. "Caesar," came a younger voice. Marcus glanced back to see Tribune Lucius Cassius, one of his personal guards and among the few men he trusted completely. The young officer's scarred face bore testament to years of faithful service, earned through courage rather than political maneuvering. "The preparations proceed as ordered," Lucius reported. "The quartermaster estimates we can depart in 5 days, if the weather holds." Marcus nodded approvingly. Lucius possessed a soldier's understanding of practical matters. No flowery rhetoric, no hidden agendas, simply competent execution of orders. "Good. And what news from the city? How do the people receive word of our departure?" "Mixed reactions, as always," Lucius replied honestly. "Some express confidence in your leadership. Others worry about the cost of another campaign. The merchants seem most concerned about trade disruptions, and the Senate." Lucius hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Senator Quintus Cornelius has been vocal in his opinions regarding Eastern policy. He suggests that perhaps a more measured approach. Cornelius would suggest negotiation with barbarians if it served his commercial interests," Marcus interrupted. "The good senator owns considerable grain warehouses that profit from Eastern trade. His concern for diplomacy stems from his concern for profit margins." The emperor turned back to face the city, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Lucius, what do you make of this rebellion? Not the official reports. Your soldier's assessment." Lucius stepped closer, lowering his voice despite the privacy of the chamber. "In truth, Caesar, I suspect it runs deeper than simple unrest. The eastern provinces have always chafed under Roman rule. They remember their independence, their own kings and customs. This may be more than local discontent. It could be organized resistance." Marcus appreciated the young tribune's candor. Too many courtiers told him what they thought he wanted to hear, but Lucius offered honest military judgment. "Your recommendation? Show strength, but also show mercy," Lucius replied. "Crush the rebellion swiftly, but offer generous terms to those who surrender. Fear and hope working together, wisdom beyond your years," Marcus observed. "Very well. We shall take both the sword and the olive branch to Antioch." As the day progressed, the imperial palace transformed into a hive of activity. Servants packed the emperor's personal effects, while scribes prepared the necessary documents for governing the empire from a distance. The logistics of moving an imperial court were staggering: hundreds of people, tons of supplies, and enough military force to remind the provinces that Rome's power remained absolute. Marcus found himself drawn repeatedly to his private study, where maps of the eastern territories covered an entire wall. Each province was marked with colored pins, indicating loyal cities, neutral territories, and areas of concern. The pattern that emerged troubled him. The unrest was not random, but seemed to follow trade routes and communication lines, suggesting coordination beyond mere local grievances. "A copper for your thoughts." "Old friend," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Marcus looked up to see General Titus Flavius Maximus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, and perhaps his oldest surviving friend. They had served together as young officers in Germania, forging a bond that had endured through decades of political turbulence. "The same thoughts that have occupied generals for centuries," Marcus replied. "How to maintain peace through strength without becoming a tyrant in the process." Titus stepped into the study, his experienced gaze taking in the maps and documents scattered across the desk. "The burden of command never grows lighter, does it? Only our backs grow weaker beneath its weight. Sometimes I wonder if we delude ourselves," Marcus mused. We speak of bringing Roman law, Roman peace, Roman civilization to distant lands. But perhaps what we truly bring is Roman will imposed upon peoples who never asked for our guidance. Philosophical doubts at this stage of your reign? Titus asked, settling into a chair across from the emperor. That's unlike you. Marcus managed a tired smile. Perhaps age brings unwanted wisdom. I find myself questioning motives that once seemed perfectly clear. The eastern provinces need strong leadership, Titus said pragmatically. Whether they asked for it or not, they are part of our empire now. Allowing rebellion to succeed would only encourage others to test our resolve. You speak like a soldier, Marcus observed, because I am a soldier. And so are you, beneath all the purple silk and golden laurels. When diplomacy fails, when negotiation proves useless, sometimes force is the only language that prevents greater bloodshed. The emperor nodded, knowing his friend spoke truth. Yet something in his heart yearned for a different solution. A path that did not require marching legions into foreign lands to enforce Roman will upon reluctant subjects. Perhaps it was simply weariness after decades of rule, or perhaps it was the approaching autumn of his life that made him seek gentler solutions to eternal problems. Tell me about the reports from our agents in Antioch, Marcus requested, focusing his mind on practical matters. What drives this rebellion beyond the usual complaints about taxation? Titus unrolled a smaller scroll from his belt. According to our sources, the movement centers around a charismatic leader named Alexander of Tyre. Former merchant, well-traveled, speaks multiple languages. He's been preaching a message of Eastern independence, claiming that Rome has grown weak and distracted by internal politics. And the people believe him. Enough do. He's promised reduced taxes, local autonomy, and protection of traditional customs. Standard revolutionary rhetoric, but effective among those who feel overlooked by distant Roman rule. Marcus stood and walked to the window, watching afternoon shadows lengthen across the palace courtyard. Perhaps Alexander of Tyre speaks more truth than he knows. Have we grown distant from our provinces? So focused on the glory of Rome that we forget the people who make our empire possible. Caesar, Titus said carefully, such thoughts are dangerous. An emperor who doubts his authority invites challenges to his rule. An emperor who never questions his authority becomes a tyrant, Marcus countered. The difference between a king and a despot lies not in power, but in wisdom. The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. At Marcus's command, a young page entered and bowed deeply. Caesar, forgiveness for the intrusion. A message has arrived from the eastern provinces, marked urgent. Marcus accepted the sealed document, noting the quality of the parchment and the unfamiliar hand that had written his name. Breaking the seal, he read quickly, his expression growing more troubled with each line. What news? Titus inquired. It seems our friend Alexander has been busy, Marcus replied grimly. He's managed to convince 3 major cities to declare independence from Roman rule. Their governors have been displaced, killed. The message does not specify their fate, but I suspect mercy was not extended. Marcus set the parchment aside and looked directly at his old friend. Ready the legions. We depart for Antioch in 3 days, not 5. As evening approached and the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, Marcus found himself alone in his chambers, staring into the flames of the brazier that provided warmth against the autumn chill. Tomorrow would bring more preparations, more decisions, more responsibilities that weighed upon his shoulders like lead cloaks. He thought of Alexander of Tyre, this unknown rebel who dared challenge the might of Rome. Part of him felt anger at such audacity, but another part, the part that remembered being young and idealistic, almost admired the man's courage. How many Roman nobles would risk everything for a principle? How many would sacrifice comfort and safety for the chance to lead their people toward a different future? The emperor's meditation was interrupted by memories of another time, another place, another moment when someone small and seemingly powerless had shown unexpected courage. Years ago, during the campaign in the northern provinces, when he had encountered that remarkable child who had approached him without fear. who had spoken with the simple certainty that only innocence could muster. He wondered what had become of her, the little girl who had declared she would be his empress someday. The memory brought an unexpected smile to his weathered features. Such faith, such absolute conviction in the face of impossible odds. Perhaps the world needed more people willing to believe in impossible dreams. Marcus lifted a cup of wine to his lips, tasting the rich vintage from his private reserves. Tomorrow would bring the harsh realities of imperial duty. Tonight, however, he allowed himself the luxury of remembering a time when hope seemed simpler, when promises carried the weight of destiny, and when a small girl's courage had reminded him that some things in life were worth protecting. Outside his window, Rome slept under a canopy of stars that had watched over the eternal city for 1,000 years. Soon he would march eastward to face rebellion and restore order to his empire. But for now, he sat quietly in the warmth of his chambers, holding on to memories of innocence and the strange comfort they brought to his weary soul. 3 days later, the imperial column stretched along the ancient road like a crimson serpent winding through the countryside. Marcus rode at its head, his white destrier stepping proudly beneath the weight of ceremonial armor that caught the morning sunlight. Behind him followed 2 full legions, 12,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, their bronze shields and iron-tipped spears creating a forest of gleaming metal that spoke of imperial might. The emperor's thoughts dwelled, not on the splendor of his procession, but on the reports that had reached him during their first night's camp. The rebellion in Antioch had spread faster than wildfire in a drought-stricken forest. 4 more cities had declared independence, and Alexander of Tyre had proclaimed himself king of the eastern provinces. Such audacity would have been laughable if it were not, backed by genuine military force, the rebel had somehow acquired weapons and trained soldiers enough to challenge Roman authority. Caesar, called Tribune Lucius, riding up alongside the emperor's mount. The advanced scouts report smoke ahead, the village of Palmyra Minor. Marcus raised his hand, signaling the column to halt. The rhythmic tramp of marching feet gradually ceased, replaced by the whispered conversations of soldiers grateful for a brief respite. "How far?" he asked. 2 miles, perhaps less. "The smoke appears to rise from multiple sources." The emperor's jaw tightened. Palmyra Minor was a peaceful trading settlement, notable only for its position along the main eastern road. If Alexander's rebellion had reached even such remote places, the situation was worse than his advisors had indicated. "Form defensive positions," Marcus commanded. "Send the cavalry ahead to assess the situation. If there are survivors, they are to be protected at all costs." As the legions deployed with practiced efficiency, Marcus found himself studying the horizon, where thin columns of black smoke rose against the azure sky. Each wisp represented homes destroyed, lives disrupted, and the failure of Roman protection to reach where it was most needed. The weight of those lives pressed upon his conscience like stones in a sack. The cavalry returned within the hour, their horses lathered and their faces grim. Captain Servius Brutus, a veteran officer whose scarred features told stories of countless campaigns, approached the emperor with obvious reluctance. "Report," Marcus ordered. "The village burns, Caesar, but not from enemy action. The people set fire to their own homes, rather than see them occupied by rebels. Most of the population has fled eastward, but we found a few families hiding in the temple of Jupiter. Survivors? Perhaps 30 souls, mostly women and children. The men of fighting age either fled with the others or—" Servius hesitated. "Speak plainly, Captain." "They joined the rebellion, Caesar. According to the temple priest, Alexander's agents promised them land and freedom from Roman taxation. Many young men found such promises attractive. Marcus absorbed this information in silence. The rebellion was not merely a military uprising, but a genuine movement that appealed to the hearts and minds of common people. Alexander of Tyre had succeeded where so many other rebels had failed. He had given his followers a vision of something better than Roman rule. "Bring the survivors here," the emperor commanded. "They will have food, protection, and safe passage to whatever destination they choose." As the small group of refugees approached the imperial column, Marcus dismounted and walked forward to meet them personally. It was a gesture that surprised his bodyguards, but one that felt necessary. These people had lost everything, their homes, their livelihoods, their security. The least their emperor could do was look them in the eye and acknowledge their suffering. Among the survivors, Marcus noticed a family consisting of an elderly man, a middle-aged woman, and a girl of perhaps 10 summers. The child clung to her grandmother's skirts, but watched the approaching emperor with wide, unafraid eyes that reminded him of someone, though he could not immediately place the memory. "Good people," Marcus addressed the group, his voice carrying clearly across the small gathering. "You have suffered greatly, and for that Rome shares your grief. You will be given food, shelter, and escort to any destination you choose. Your loyalty to the empire will not be forgotten." The elderly priest who had sheltered them stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your generosity honors us, Caesar, but if I may speak freely, the people are confused. They hear promises from both sides. Rome speaks of law and order, while the rebels promise freedom and prosperity. How are simple folk to know which path leads to happiness?" It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of the rebellion's appeal. Marcus considered his answer carefully, aware that his words would be repeated in countless conversations throughout the eastern provinces. "Freedom without law becomes chaos," he replied thoughtfully. "Prosperity without security becomes temporary gain that vanishes with the next strong wind. Rome offers something more valuable than promises. We offer certainty. The law that protects a citizen in Germania protects equally a citizen in Gaul or Syria. The roads that carry trade from Britain to Egypt carry prosperity to all who use them. This is the gift of empire, not perfection, but consistency." The priest nodded respectfully. But Marcus could see in the man's eyes that his words, however well-intentioned, rang hollow to people who had just lost their homes. What good was Roman law to a family with no roof over their heads? What value had imperial roads to merchants whose goods lay scattered in the ashes of their shops? As the refugees were led away to receive food and care, Marcus found his attention drawn once more to the young girl who had watched him so intently. She walked between her elders with the careful dignity of a child, trying to be brave in frightening circumstances. Something about her bearing, her refusal to be cowed by tragedy, stirred a memory that hovered just beyond conscious recollection. "Caesar," Gaius approached with a scroll in his hands, "a message from Governor Fabius. The situation in Antioch grows more desperate. Alexander has declared himself king and established a rival court. He's demanding tribute from all cities within 100 miles of the capital." Marcus accepted the document, but found his gaze wandering back toward the refugees. "Tell me, Gaius, what drives a man to abandon the security of empire for the uncertainty of rebellion? Greed, usually, or ambition. Sometimes simple madness." "No," Marcus said slowly. "I think it is something deeper. It is the desire to believe that things can be different, that tomorrow might be better than today. Alexander offers his followers hope, the one thing we have perhaps forgotten to provide. Hope is a luxury, Caesar. People need food, shelter, protection from their enemies. These things Rome provides better than any rebel king. Does it?" Marcus turned to face his advisor directly. "Look around you, old friend. See the smoke rising from that village? How well did Rome protect those people? How effectively did our legions prevent their homes from burning?" Gaius shifted uncomfortably under the emperor's gaze. "We cannot be everywhere at once. The empire is vast." "And perhaps that is the problem," Marcus interrupted. "We have grown so large that we can no longer see the faces of individual citizens. They become numbers in tax rolls, statistics in military reports, problems to be managed rather than people to be served." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the refugee camp. Raised voices and the sound of running feet drew the emperor's attention toward a cluster of soldiers surrounding something on the ground. Marcus strode quickly toward the disturbance, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "What happens here?" he demanded, as the soldiers parted to make way for their emperor. On the ground lay a young man, perhaps 20 years of age. his clothing torn and his face streaked with blood. He had clearly been running hard before collapsing from exhaustion. One of the refugees, the elderly priest, knelt beside him. Offering water from a clay cup, he stumbled into our camp, reported Tribune Lucius. Appears to be wounded, possibly a deserter from someone's army. Marcus knelt beside the fallen youth, studying his features and the quality of his garments. Though travel-stained and torn, the fabric spoke of middle-class origins. A merchant's son, perhaps, or a minor official's family. "Can you speak?" the Emperor asked gently. The young man's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on the face above him. When he recognized the purple cloak and imperial regalia, his expression shifted from confusion to desperate urgency. "Caesar," he whispered, struggling to sit upright despite his injuries. "I bring word from Antioch. The city... Alexander has taken the city. Governor Fabius is dead. The rebels control everything east of the Euphrates." A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled soldiers and advisors. If this news proved accurate, the rebellion had succeeded beyond anyone's worst fears. The eastern provinces, source of grain, spices, and tribute that fed half the empire, had effectively declared independence from Roman rule. "How do you know this?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the magnitude of what he was hearing. "I served in the governor's household," the messenger replied, accepting more water from the priest. "I was there when Alexander's army breached the walls. The governor tried to negotiate, but the rebels would accept nothing less than complete surrender. When he refused to renounce his oath to Rome," the young man's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear enough. Marcus stood slowly, his mind racing through the implications of this news. Everything had changed in an instant. What had begun as a provincial rebellion requiring firm but measured response had become a full-scale war that threatened the unity of the empire itself. "Rest now," he told the messenger. "You have done Rome great service by bringing this word." As the soldiers dispersed and the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Marcus found himself standing alone beside the dying fires of Palmyra Minor. The wind carried the scent of smoke and ash across the abandoned village, a bitter reminder of how quickly security could vanish, and how easily the bonds that held civilization together could be severed. For the first time since assuming the purple, Emperor Marcus Aurelius Severan wondered if the empire he had devoted his life to serving might be too large, too diverse, too unwieldy to survive the forces that were tearing it apart. And in that moment of doubt, he thought again of the small girl who had approached him years ago with such absolute faith in the power of promises to shape the future. Perhaps the world needed that kind of faith now more than ever. The Imperial War Council convened that evening in Marcus's command tent, a structure of purple silk and golden cords that had sheltered Roman emperors through countless campaigns. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across maps spread upon a wooden table, their light illuminating the faces of generals and advisors whose expressions ranged from concern to barely concealed panic. "The situation is worse than we imagined," General Titus began without preamble, his finger tracing the extent of rebel territory on the largest map. "If the messenger speaks truth, Alexander controls everything from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean coast. That's nearly a third of our eastern territories." Marcus studied the markings that showed loyal cities in blue, rebel-held territories in red, and unknown areas in yellow. The red dominated the eastern portion of the map like a spreading stain. "What of our remaining strongholds?" "Damascus holds but barely," reported Gaius, consulting a sheaf of dispatches. "The garrison commander requests immediate reinforcement. Alexandria remains loyal, but they're cut off from overland supply routes. The fortress at Palmyra Major could serve as a base for operations, but it's dangerously isolated." Tribune Lucius leaned forward, his scarred features grave in the lamplight. "Caesar, with respect to all present, we face a choice that will define your reign. Do we attempt to reclaim lost territory through force, or do we negotiate with Alexander as though he were a legitimate king?" The tent fell silent, except for the whisper of wind against silk and the distant sounds of soldiers preparing evening meals. Marcus understood the weight of the decision before him. Military action would be costly in both lives and resources, with no guarantee of success. Negotiation would acknowledge Alexander's legitimacy and might encourage other ambitious provincial leaders to test Roman resolve. "Tell me about this Alexander of Tyre," Marcus requested. "What manner of man inspires such loyalty that people will die for his cause?" General Titus consulted his notes. "According to our intelligence, he's perhaps 40 years of age, well-educated, and speaks Latin as fluently as Greek or Aramaic. He spent years traveling the trade routes between Asia and Europe, which gave him connections throughout the eastern provinces. The people see him as one of their own rather than a foreign ruler. And his military capabilities? Unknown but clearly substantial. Taking Antioch required sophisticated planning and significant force. He's either a natural military genius or has skilled commanders advising him." Marcus walked to the tent's entrance and pulled back the flap, gazing out at the campfires that dotted the darkness like earthbound stars. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in the rebel-held territories, similar fires burned around different banners. How many of those soldiers had once served Rome faithfully? How many had taken their oath of loyalty seriously before circumstances drove them to rebellion? "There is another consideration," Gaius said quietly. "The Senate will expect swift action. Any appearance of weakness could encourage other provinces to test our resolve. Britannia has always been restless, and the Germanic tribes watch for signs of Roman weakness. The Senate sits comfortably in Rome while we face the consequences of their policies," Marcus replied, though his tone carried more weariness than anger. "They vote for taxes that burden the provinces, then wonder why the provinces rebel. Caesar," Tribune Lucius ventured carefully, "perhaps there is a middle path. What if we were to offer Alexander terms, not as equals, but as Rome has done with other client kings? Allow him to rule his territories under Roman oversight, with regular tribute and acknowledgement of imperial authority." General Titus shook his head vigorously. Such a precedent would be disastrous. Every ambitious governor would see rebellion as a path to independent rule. We would have a dozen civil wars within the year. And yet, Marcus mused, Lucius may have identified something important. Alexander succeeded because he offered the people something we have failed to provide: hope for a better future. Perhaps our response should address that failure rather than simply crushing the symptoms. The emperor returned to the table and studied the map more carefully, noting the positions of major cities, trade routes, and defensive positions. "What would you estimate as our chances of military success?" "Difficult to assess without knowing the enemy's true strength," Titus admitted. "If we could retake Damascus and establish secure supply lines, we might be able to advance methodically. But urban warfare is always costly, and we would be fighting people defending their homes rather than foreign invaders. Time favors our enemies," Gaius added. "The longer this rebellion continues, the more likely other provinces are to join them. Alexander grows stronger with each passing day while we debate strategy." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. The mathematics of empire were unforgiving. Delay meant weakness, and weakness invited further challenges to imperial authority. Yet hasty action could prove equally disastrous if it resulted in military defeat or unnecessary bloodshed. "Send riders to Damascus with orders to hold at all costs," he decided. "Promise them reinforcement within the month. Dispatch messages to Alexandria, assuring them of our support, and requesting detailed intelligence about rebel activities. And," he paused, considering his next words carefully, "send an envoy to Alexander of Tyre." The tent erupted in surprised murmurs. General Titus looked particularly troubled. "Caesar, surely you do not intend to negotiate?" "I intend to understand," Marcus interrupted firmly. "Before we commit thousands of lives to battle, I want to know what drives this rebellion. What does Alexander offer that we do not? What grievances fuel his support? Thou teaches that knowing your enemy is the foundation of victory, and if he refuses to receive our envoy, Then we will have learned something important about his character and his confidence. Marcus rolled up the largest map and handed it to Gaius. Choose someone for this mission carefully. We need a man who can observe and report accurately, not a diplomat who will see only what flatters our assumptions. As the council dispersed to implement these decisions, Marcus remained in his tent, staring at the remaining maps and documents. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Each choice he made would ripple outward, affecting thousands of lives across the breadth of the empire. The wrong decision could cost him not only the eastern provinces, but potentially his throne. A soft knock at the tent pole interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, expecting another report or urgent message. To his surprise, the elderly priest from the refugee camp stepped through the entrance, his simple robes and humble bearing contrasting sharply with the military splendor surrounding him. He bowed respectfully, but not fearfully, the bow of a man who honored authority without being cowed by it. "Caesar, forgiveness for this intrusion. I seek a moment of your time, if it may be granted." Marcus gestured to a camp chair. "Please sit. You have shown kindness to those in need. The least I can do is hear your words." The priest settled himself carefully, his aged hands folded in his lap. "I have served Jupiter faithfully for 40 years, through the reigns of 3 emperors. I have seen war and peace, prosperity and hardship. If I may speak plainly, what I see now troubles me greatly. Continue. The people are afraid, Caesar, not just of war, but of choosing wrongly. They remember the promises Rome made when first we came to their lands. Protection, prosperity, justice under law. Yet many feel those promises have been forgotten by rulers who see them only as sources of revenue." Marcus leaned forward, recognizing the truth in the priest's words. "What would you have Rome do differently?" "Remember that an empire is not held together by fear alone, but by the conviction that joining it improves lives rather than merely changing masters. Alexander succeeds because he speaks to hearts as well as minds. He offers dignity as well as freedom." The priest's words echoed in Marcus's mind long after the old man had departed. As he prepared for sleep, the emperor found himself thinking not of military strategies or political calculations, but of the human faces behind the rebellion, people seeking something better than what Rome had offered them. Perhaps, he thought, as exhaustion finally claimed him, the true battle would not be won with swords, but with the harder task of earning trust that had been lost. 5 days later, the imperial column had established a fortified camp outside the ruins of Palmyra Minor. Marcus had chosen the location carefully, close enough to the eastern territories to project strength, but positioned defensively should Alexander's forces attempt a surprise attack. The systematic efficiency of Roman military engineering had transformed an empty field into a miniature city, complete with earthwork ramparts, organized streets, and proper sanitation facilities. The emperor walked these improvised streets each morning, greeting soldiers by name and inquiring about their families back home. It was a practice that had served him well throughout his military career. Men fought harder for a commander who saw them as individuals rather than mere numbers in formation. Today, however, his morning rounds carried additional purpose. Word had arrived that his envoy to Alexander had returned. Marcus found Centurion Gaius Marcellus waiting in the command tent, still dusty from hard travel. The officer was a career soldier whose weathered features and numerous scars testified to decades of faithful service. More importantly, he possessed the intelligence and discretion necessary for delicate diplomatic missions. "Report." "Centurion," Marcus commanded, settling into his chair and gesturing for the man to sit as well. "Caesar, I was received by Alexander of Tyre after 3 days of negotiation with his subordinates. He agreed to the meeting, but insisted it take place in the main square of Antioch before assembled citizens, a clear attempt to demonstrate his popular support." Marcus nodded, unsurprised by such political theatre. "Describe the man himself." "Impressive, I must admit," Marcellus replied with professional honesty. Perhaps 2 score years, well built, speaks with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. His Greek is elegant, his Latin fluent, and he demonstrated familiarity with Roman military tactics that suggests formal training. Former legionnaire? Possible, though he denied any military service to Rome when I inquired. More likely he studied our methods as a merchant traveling imperial roads. His knowledge of trade routes and provincial politics is encyclopedic. The emperor leaned forward, interested despite himself. What of his message to us? Marcellus reached into his travel pack and withdrew a scroll sealed with unfamiliar wax. He insisted I memorize his words exactly before giving me this written response. His verbal message was, "Tell your emperor that Alexander of Tyre bears no hatred for Rome or its people. The East seeks independence, not conquest. Let Caesar keep his western domains and acknowledge our sovereignty over the lands we have liberated. There need be no war between us." Marcus broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, reading the formal language that diplomatic protocol required. The written version was more elaborate, but conveyed the same essential message. Alexander sought recognition as an independent ruler rather than submission to imperial authority. What was your assessment of his military strength? Substantial, Caesar. I counted at least 8,000 trained soldiers within Antioch alone, and citizens spoke of additional forces stationed throughout the eastern territories. His equipment appears well maintained, and his men showed good discipline. Most concerning, many of his officers wear insignia suggesting previous Roman military service. This last detail troubled Marcus considerably. Desertion from the legions was not uncommon during civil wars, but wholesale defection of experienced officers suggested problems that went beyond simple opportunism or local grievances. Did you observe anything else of significance? Marcellus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The people seemed genuinely enthusiastic about Alexander's rule. I expected to find subjects cowed by military occupation, but instead witnessed citizens who appeared to view him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. His administration has reduced taxation and eliminated several unpopular Roman regulations. The markets were busy, trade was flowing, and I heard no complaints about his governance. The emperor absorbed this information in thoughtful silence. An incompetent rebel might be easily defeated, but a capable administrator who commanded genuine loyalty presented a far more serious challenge. Alexander had succeeded in creating an alternative to Roman rule that apparently satisfied his subjects' basic needs while appealing to their desire for self-governance. There is one more thing. Caesar, Marcellus continued, Alexander specifically requested that I convey his respect for your reputation as a soldier and ruler. He said, and I quote, "Marcus Aurelius Severan is known throughout the East as a just emperor. Perhaps he will prove wise enough to recognize that some seeds, once planted, cannot be uprooted without destroying the soil itself." Poetic language for a merchant turned rebel king, Marcus observed dryly. A commotion outside the tent interrupted their conversation. Raised voices and the sound of horses arriving at speed suggested urgent news. Tribune Lucius appeared at the tent entrance moments later, his expression grim. "Caesar, riders from Damascus. The garrison commander reports that Alexander's forces have surrounded the city. They offer terms, surrender within 7 days, or face assault." Marcus felt the familiar weight of decision settling upon his shoulders. Each piece of news narrowed his options and increased the pressure for decisive action. If Damascus fell, Rome would lose its last major stronghold in the eastern territories. "How large a force surrounds Damascus?" he asked. "The messenger estimates 6,000 troops, well-equipped and disciplined. They've cut the aqueducts and blocked all roads leading to the city. The garrison can hold perhaps 2 weeks if rationing is imposed immediately." The emperor turned to Marcellus. "In your judgment, could we relieve Damascus with our current forces?" "Possible, Caesar, but costly. We would need to march quickly through territory now controlled by the enemy, fight a battle against prepared positions, then maintain supply lines through hostile country." Even if successful, we would suffer heavy casualties and might find ourselves besieged in turn. Marcus walked to his private map table and studied the positions of major cities and military units. The mathematical reality was stark. He possessed perhaps 15,000 soldiers scattered across multiple locations, while Alexander commanded at least 20,000 concentrated in defensible positions. Conventional military wisdom suggested avoiding battle until the odds improved. Send word to the Damascus garrison, he decided. They are to hold as long as possible, but if the situation becomes hopeless, they have permission to negotiate honorable surrender terms. I will not sacrifice those men needlessly. Caesar, General Titus protested, having arrived during the conversation. Abandoning Damascus would leave Alexander in control of virtually the entire eastern frontier, and losing 2,000 veteran soldiers would leave us unable to mount any effective campaign, Marcus replied firmly. Sometimes withdrawal preserves strength for future action better than futile gestures of defiance. As his officers departed to implement these orders, Marcus remained alone with his thoughts and maps. The situation demanded creative solutions rather than conventional military responses. Alexander had outmaneuvered him politically and strategically, leaving few good options for immediate counteraction. The emperor's brooding was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, the young girl from the refugee family, the one whose steady gaze had reminded him of someone he could not quite place. She stood uncertainly at the tent entrance, clutching a small wooden horse carved with obvious skill. Caesar, she said in accented but clear Latin. My grandmother said I should thank you for your kindness to our family. Marcus smiled, grateful for this interruption from weightier concerns. What is your name, child? Lydia, Caesar. This belonged to my brother, but he went with the men to join Alexander. Grandmother says I should give it to someone who protects people, so they remember why they fight. She extended the wooden toy toward him with both hands, her expression serious beyond her years. Something about the gesture, a child offering her most precious possession to an adult she trusted, stirred memories that had lain dormant for years. Marcus accepted the gift carefully, noting the fine craftsmanship and the wear patterns that spoke of a beloved plaything. I shall treasure this, Lydia, and I promise to remember why we fight, not for glory or conquest, but to protect people like you and your family. As the girl departed with a shy smile, Marcus found himself holding the wooden horse and remembering another child years ago, who had approached him with similar courage and faith in the power of promises to shape the future. The fall of Damascus came not with the clash of arms, but with the quiet opening of gates in the pre-dawn darkness. The garrison commander, facing starvation and the certain death of civilians under his protection, had chosen pragmatism over heroic gestures. When the news reached Marcus 3 days later, he received it with the stoic acceptance of a man who had seen too many battles to rage against inevitable defeats. Alexander offered generous terms, reported the messenger who had witnessed the surrender. All Roman soldiers were permitted to depart with their weapons and personal effects. Citizens who wished to leave were given safe passage. Those who remained were promised protection under the new administration. Marcus nodded grimly. Such magnanimity served Alexander's purposes perfectly. It demonstrated his clemency to potential allies while avoiding the brutal sieges that might turn public opinion against him. The rebel king was proving himself as skilled at psychological warfare as at military tactics. What news of our soldiers? Tribune Lucius inquired. Most chose to return to Roman territory. Caesar. They should reach our lines within the week. However, the messenger hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to report next. Speak freely, Marcus commanded. Perhaps a dozen officers and several hundred men chose to remain in Damascus. They have accepted service with Alexander's forces. The tent fell silent, except for the whisper of wind against canvas. Defection was not unknown during civil wars, but the scale suggested problems that went beyond simple opportunism. Veteran legionnaires did not abandon their oaths lightly. Something fundamental was driving them to seek service under foreign banners. General Titus was the first to break the silence. "We should consider such men traitors and put a price on their heads." "To what purpose?" Marcus replied wearily. "They are lost to us, regardless of what names we call them. Better to ask why they chose Alexander over Rome." "Caesar," Gaius interjected carefully, "perhaps the time has come to consider a more aggressive response. Each victory makes Alexander stronger, while we appear weak and indecisive." The emperor stood and walked to the map table, studying the red markers that now dominated the eastern territories. 3 weeks ago, the rebellion had been a provincial uprising, requiring firm but measured response. Now it had evolved into a genuine threat to imperial unity, commanded by a leader who seemed to understand both military strategy and political psychology. "What forces remain available to us?" Marcus asked. "The 10th Legion here at full strength, plus the survivors from Damascus, perhaps 14,000 effective soldiers." Titus replied. "Additional reinforcements could be summoned from the western provinces, but they would require months to arrive." "And Alexander's strength?" "Unknown precisely, but our intelligence suggests at least 25,000 troops under arms, with more joining daily. He controls the major population centers and can draw recruits from throughout the eastern territories." Marcus traced the boundaries of rebel-held territory with his finger, noting how Alexander had consolidated control over the richest and most populous regions, while leaving Rome with isolated garrisons and hostile countryside. The strategic situation grew worse with each passing day. "There is another consideration," Gaius added reluctantly. "Reports from Rome indicate growing concern in the Senate. Some members question whether the eastern provinces are worth the cost of reconquest. They suggest that perhaps accommodation might serve imperial interests better than prolonged warfare." The emperor's hand stilled on the map. He understood the political calculus behind such thinking. The eastern provinces generated significant revenue, but they also required substantial military resources to maintain. If the cost of reconquest exceeded the value of the territories themselves, pragmatic senators might indeed favor negotiated settlement over expensive warfare. "What accommodations do they suggest?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Recognition of Alexander as a client king, similar to arrangements with Parthia or Armenia. He would acknowledge nominal Roman suzerainty while exercising practical independence. Regular tribute would maintain the fiction of imperial control. Such arrangements were not unprecedented. Rome had often found it cheaper to rule through local kings rather than direct administration. Yet something in Marcus rebelled against the idea of rewarding rebellion with recognition. What message would that send to other ambitious provincial leaders? Before he could respond, another commotion arose outside the tent. This time, however, the sounds suggested celebration rather than crisis, cheering soldiers and the music of victory songs. Tribune Lucius stepped outside to investigate, returning moments later with an expression of puzzled pleasure. "Caesar, a delegation approaches under flag of truce. They request immediate audience with you." "From Alexander?" "No, Caesar. They claim to represent the city of Tyre itself, Alexander's birthplace. Apparently, there has been some development in the rebel territories." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. If Alexander's support was fracturing, particularly in his home city, it might provide opportunities for Roman diplomacy to exploit. "Admit them immediately." The delegation that entered consisted of 5 men in the rich robes of prosperous merchants, led by an elderly figure whose bearing suggested natural authority. They approached with the careful respect of men who understood they walked a dangerous line between competing powers. "Caesar," their leader began in accented but fluent Latin, "I am Phoenicus of Tyre, elected speaker for the merchant council of our city. We come seeking your wisdom and protection." Continue. "Alexander of Tyre no longer speaks for our city, though he continues to use our name. His agents have imposed new taxes and trade restrictions that strangle commerce. The very freedoms he promised have been replaced by military rule that serves his ambitions rather than our prosperity." Marcus exchanged glances with his advisors. If true, this represented the first crack in Alexander's coalition, and potentially a significant one, given Tyre's importance as a commercial center. What assistance do you seek from Rome? Protection for our trade routes and recognition of our neutrality in this conflict. We wish neither to serve Alexander's rebellion nor to suffer for his actions. The merchants of Tyre have always valued stability above politics, and in exchange, Venicus smiled, revealing the merchants' instinct for negotiation. Information about Alexander's activities, safe passage for Roman agents, and assistance in disrupting his supply lines. Money flows through Tyre like water through a fountain. We know where Alexander's resources come from and where they go. The offer was tempting, but Marcus recognized the dangers as well as opportunities. If Alexander discovered Tyrian treachery, he might respond with brutal reprisals that would eliminate potential allies. Alternatively, this might be an elaborate trap designed to draw Roman forces into vulnerable positions. I require time to consider your proposal, Marcus replied diplomatically. You will be given comfortable quarters and protection while I consult with my advisors. As the Tyrian delegation was escorted away, Marcus found himself facing a new set of calculations. The rebellion that had seemed monolithically united was showing signs of internal strain. Alexander's subjects were discovering that independence came with its own costs and limitations. What do you make of this development? He asked his council. Potentially significant, Gaius replied. If we can split Alexander's coalition, we might avoid the need for costly military campaigns. Or it might be a trap designed to draw us into premature action, General Titus countered. Alexander has shown considerable cunning thus far, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. The wooden horse that young Lydia had given him sat on his desk, a reminder of the human cost of the decisions he faced. Somewhere in the rebel territories, families struggled with divided loyalties and uncertain futures. The choices he made in the coming days would determine whether those people found peace or endured more years of warfare. Summon our intelligence officers, he decided. Before we commit to any course of action, I want detailed information about conditions in Alexander's territories. If his support is truly fragmenting, we need to understand why and how we might accelerate the process. As his staff departed to implement these orders, Marcus remained alone with his maps and his doubts, wondering whether time favored patient strategy or decisive action. 2 weeks after the Tyrian delegation's arrival, Marcus's intelligence network had painted a troubling picture of conditions within Alexander's territories. The rebel king's initial popularity was indeed waning as the realities of independent rule became apparent. Higher taxes to fund his military, disrupted trade relationships with Roman territories, and the harsh discipline required to maintain order had soured many citizens on their new king's promises. Yet, Alexander was no fool. He had begun addressing these problems with the same systematic approach that had won him the rebellion. New trade agreements with Parthian merchants, reduced military expenditures through negotiated truces with neighboring tribes, and public works projects designed to provide employment for restless populations. The man was proving himself a capable administrator as well as a charismatic leader. The situation grows more complex daily, reported Quintus Metellus, Marcus's chief intelligence officer, as he spread fresh documents across the command table. Alexander faces genuine internal challenges, but he responds to them intelligently. His support remains solid in the major cities, though rural areas show more discontent. Marcus studied the detailed reports, noting patterns that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface politics. What of his military situation? Stronger than we hoped, weaker than we feared. He has perhaps 30,000 troops under arms, but many are recent recruits with limited training. His core strength remains the 8,000 veterans who seized Antioch, disciplined soldiers led by competent officers. Competent officers who once served Rome, General Titus observed bitterly. Their knowledge of our tactics makes them doubly dangerous, the emperor nodded grimly. Facing former legionnaires meant confronting enemies who understood Roman military doctrine as well as he did. Traditional advantages of superior training and organization would count for little against opponents who had learned their craft in Roman armies. "What news from Tyre?" Marcus inquired. "Their information proves accurate thus far," Metellus replied. "Alexander's tax collectors have indeed imposed heavy burdens on the merchant classes. The city's neutrality appears genuine. They seek profit, not political adventure, and our agents within Alexander's territories, making progress, though slowly. We have established contact with several disaffected groups, displaced Roman officials, overtaxed merchants, tribal leaders who feel betrayed by promises of autonomy. Nothing organized yet, but the foundations for resistance exist." Marcus absorbed this information while walking slowly around the map table, studying the intricate web of loyalties and conflicts that define the current situation. Each piece of intelligence suggested both opportunities and dangers, possibilities for success balanced against risks of catastrophic failure. "Caesar," Tribune Lucius entered the tent with obvious urgency, "a messenger from Rome. He bears the Senate's response to our situation reports." The Emperor accepted the sealed scroll with mixed feelings. Senatorial involvement often complicated rather than clarified military situations, but he needed political support for whatever strategy he ultimately chose. Breaking the official seal, he read the formal language that conveyed the collective wisdom of Rome's governing body. The message was diplomatically worded but politically clear. The Senate authorized him to pursue whatever measures might best serve the long-term interests of the empire. Such language meant they were leaving the decision entirely in his hands, while preserving their ability to support him if he succeeded, or blame him if he failed. Political courage at its finest, Marcus observed dryly. They want the eastern provinces restored, but accept no responsibility for the methods required. "Will you share the Senate's guidance with us?" Gaius asked. "There is no guidance, only authorization to act as we see fit, which means the decision and its consequences rest entirely with us." The Emperor set the scroll aside and returned his attention to more immediate concerns. Intelligence gathering was providing useful information, but eventually decision would require action. Each day of delay allowed Alexander to consolidate his position, while Roman authority appeared increasingly hollow. "I want to see this situation personally," Marcus announced. "Tomorrow I will travel to Tyre under diplomatic cover. If we are to exploit the cracks in Alexander's coalition, I need to understand the people involved." His advisors exchanged concerned glances. General Titus was the first to voice their collective worry. "Caesar, entering rebel territory personally involves considerable risk. If Alexander were to capture you—" "He won't," Marcus interrupted. "The Tyrians have guaranteed safe passage, and Alexander has shown himself a man of honor in his treatment of prisoners and negotiators. Besides, sometimes emperors must take calculated risks to achieve necessary goals." The truth was more complex than he cared to admit to his subordinates. After weeks of receiving second-hand reports and conflicting intelligence, Marcus felt disconnected from the human reality of the rebellion. He needed to see for himself the faces of people caught between competing loyalties, to understand what drove them to choose Alexander over Rome. Preparations for the journey required careful planning. A small escort of trusted soldiers, civilian clothing to avoid attention, and detailed intelligence about safe routes through territories where Roman uniforms might invite attack. The party would travel as merchants seeking to restore trade relationships, a cover story that would explain their interest in political conditions. As evening approached, Marcus found himself walking through the refugee camp that had grown around his military encampment. Families displaced by the rebellion had sought protection under Roman banners, creating a community of the dispossessed that reminded him daily of the human cost of political conflicts. Near the camp's center, he encountered the family that had given him the wooden horse, the elderly priest, the middle-aged woman, and young Lydia, The girl was helping her grandmother prepare the evening meal, her movements careful and deliberate as she tended a small cooking fire. "Caesar," the priest rose and bowed respectfully as Marcus approached. "Your presence honors our humble camp." "The honor is mine," Marcus replied, settling onto a simple wooden stool beside their fire. "How do you fare? Are your needs being met?" "Your soldiers are generous with food and protection," the woman answered. "But we worry about the future. Will we ever see our home again?" It was a question Marcus could not answer honestly. The rebellion showed no signs of immediate collapse, and even Roman victory might not restore conditions that would allow displaced families to return safely to their former lives. "Tell me," he said instead, "what would convince you that peace was truly restored? What would make you feel safe enough to rebuild your lives?" The priest considered the question carefully. "Trust, Caesar. People must believe that their rulers, whether Roman or otherwise, truly care about their welfare rather than simply viewing them as sources of revenue or military service. And how does one earn such trust? By keeping promises," young Lydia said unexpectedly, looking up from her work at the fire. "When someone says they will protect you, they should mean it. When they promise things will get better, they should make sure it happens." Her simple words carried more wisdom than many diplomatic treaties Marcus had negotiated. Trust, once broken, required patient effort to restore. Alexander had succeeded partially because he offered hope to people who felt abandoned by Roman promises. Defeating him militarily would accomplish nothing if it left those underlying grievances unaddressed. "You speak wisely," Marcus told the girl. "Perhaps when this conflict ends, there will be opportunities to keep better promises." As he prepared to leave, Lydia approached and pressed something into his hand, a small clay figure of a horse, obviously made by her own inexperienced fingers. "To keep the other one company," she explained shyly, "so it won't be lonely." Walking back to his command tent under a star-filled sky, Marcus reflected on the strange wisdom of children and the weight of adult responsibilities. Tomorrow's journey would bring him face to face with the human reality behind political abstractions. Whatever he learned might determine not only the fate of the rebellion, but the future relationship between Rome and the peoples it claimed to govern. The journey to Tyre required 3 days through countryside that bore the mixed scars of war and recovery. Marcus traveled in the guise of a Roman merchant named Gaius Maximus, his imperial regalia replaced by the practical garments of a prosperous trader. His small escort, Tribune Lucius and 6 trusted soldiers, maintained the fiction of hired guards protecting valuable cargo. The roads told stories of rapid change. Roman milestones stood beside new markers bearing Alexander's eagle symbol, while checkpoints, flying rebel banners, had replaced imperial tax stations. Yet the people they encountered seemed neither oppressed nor particularly enthusiastic about their new rulers. Mostly, they appeared focused on the practical business of survival in uncertain times. "The countryside seems peaceful enough," Lucius observed, as they paused to water their horses at a roadside inn. "Surface calm," Marcus replied, watching how locals interacted with Alexander's soldiers at the checkpoint ahead. "But notice how carefully people choose their words. They speak of the weather and trade, not politics." The inn itself provided revealing glimpses into life under rebel rule. Prices had risen due to disrupted trade routes, but the quality of available goods remained high thanks to new agreements with Eastern merchants. Alexander's administration was clearly working to maintain economic stability, even at the cost of higher taxation. As they approached Tyre's famous walls, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and unease that preceded diplomatic missions into uncertain territory. The city's harbors bustled with merchant vessels flying a dozen different flags, Phoenician, Egyptian, Parthian, and others, suggesting that Alexander's promises of free trade were being honored, despite the political upheaval. Phoenicus met them at the main gate with an escort of city guards whose polished armor and disciplined bearing impressed Marcus despite himself. The merchant leader had exchanged his previous diplomatic robes for practical travel clothes. But his bearing retained the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Welcome to Tyre, Gaius Maximus," he said with the slight emphasis that indicated he knew exactly who his visitor truly was. "Your timing is fortunate. The city prepares for the festival of Melkart, which brings merchants from across the Middle Sea." As they entered the city proper, Marcus marveled at Tyre's continued prosperity despite the political chaos surrounding it. The famous purple dye works continued production, their vats steaming in the Mediterranean sun. Markets overflowed with goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Most remarkably, he saw no signs of military occupation. Alexander's forces were apparently content to leave the city's internal affairs to its merchant council. "Your new king shows remarkable restraint," Marcus observed as they walked through the bustling commercial district. "Alexander understands that Tyre's wealth comes from trade, not conquest," Phoenicus replied. "He takes his taxes and tribute, but interferes little with our business practices. It is a pragmatic arrangement that serves both our interests." They were housed in a comfortable villa overlooking the harbor, where Marcus could observe the constant flow of ships that made Tyre one of the wealthiest cities in the eastern Mediterranean. As evening approached, Phoenicus arranged a private dinner where they could discuss more sensitive matters away from curious ears. "You wished information about Alexander's activities," the merchant began once. "Servants had withdrawn and left them alone with wine and simple fare. What I can tell you may surprise you. Continue. The man you fight is not the same person who began this rebellion. Success has changed him, but perhaps not in ways you might expect." Phoenicus paused to sip his wine thoughtfully. When Alexander first proclaimed independence, he spoke of justice and freedom for all Eastern peoples. Now he speaks increasingly of destiny and divine favor. Marcus leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Explain." "He has begun consulting oracles and astrologers. He speaks of signs and portents that supposedly confirm his right to rule. More concerning, he has started referring to himself as the heir to ancient kings, Alexander of Macedon, the pharaohs of Egypt, the emperors of Persia." This was troubling news indeed. Megalomaniacal delusions had destroyed many capable leaders throughout history. If Alexander was losing touch with practical reality, it might create opportunities for his enemies, or it might make him more dangerous and unpredictable. "What evidence do you have of this change?" Phoenicus gestured toward the harbor, where torches illuminated ships riding at anchor. 3 months ago, Alexander's agents negotiated fair trade agreements that benefited both Tyre and his territories. Last month, those same agents demanded tribute payments fit for a god-king rather than a mortal ruler. When our council protested, they were told that divine authority does not negotiate with mere merchants. Yet you continue to honor his demands. For now. But the merchant council grows restless. "We are practical people who understand that even god-kings require mortal gold to pay their armies." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the street below, voices raised in what sounded like celebration rather than alarm. Marcus moved to the window and looked down to see torchlight processions moving through Tyre's main thoroughfares. "Festival preparations," Phoenicus explained, joining him at the window. "Though this year's celebrations carry additional significance, Alexander has announced that he will attend personally to receive the city's formal submission and tribute." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The rebel king's presence in Tyre would provide an unprecedented opportunity for intelligence gathering, or potentially for more direct action if circumstances permitted. "When does he arrive?" "Tomorrow, according to the latest messages. He travels with a considerable retinue, but not a full army. Apparently, he considers Tyre secure enough to warrant only a ceremonial guard." As they watched the torch-lit processions wind through the city streets, Marcus reflected on the strange turns that had brought him to this place. 3 months ago, he had been dealing with routine administrative matters in Rome. Now he found himself disguised as a merchant in a rebel-held city. gathering intelligence about an enemy who might be descending into madness. "There is something else you should know," Phoenicus said quietly. "Alexander no longer travels alone. For the past month, he has been accompanied by a woman who serves as his chief advisor. Some say she is a priestess, others claim she is a sorceress. What is certain is that she wields considerable influence over his decisions." "A woman advisor?" Marcus asked, surprised despite the customs of Eastern kingdoms, where female counselors were not uncommon. Young, beautiful, and apparently very persuasive. She speaks multiple languages and demonstrates familiarity with both Eastern and Western customs. Alexander is said to value her counsel above that of his generals. The merchant's words stirred something in Marcus's memory, a half-formed recollection that he could not quite grasp. Something about a young woman and a promise made long ago in very different circumstances. Has this advisor a name? "She is called Lydia of Antioch, though some say she was born elsewhere and only adopted that city as her home. What is certain is that Alexander treats her with the deference usually reserved for royalty." Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet as memory suddenly crystallized with perfect clarity. The refugee camp, the burning village, a small girl with steady eyes who had approached him without fear and declared with absolute certainty that she would be his empress someday. The child who had been told to wait, to allow time to ripen what fate had sown. "Describe her," he managed, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in his thoughts. "Perhaps 25 years of age, dark hair, striking features. She carries herself with natural authority and speaks with the educated accent of someone raised in noble households. Most remarkably, she shows no fear of Alexander's volatile moods. Indeed, she seems to be the only person capable of moderating his more extreme impulses." The emperor gripped the window ledge as the full implications struck him. The little girl, who had captured his heart with her innocent faith, had grown into a woman who now advised his greatest enemy. The promise he had made, to wait for time to ripen their destined meeting, had been fulfilled in the most unexpected and challenging way imaginable. "This woman," Marcus said carefully, "does she ever speak of her past? Her family, her origins?" "Little is known. She appeared in Antioch shortly before the rebellion began, already possessing Alexander's confidence. Some whisper that she was the one who convinced him to proclaim independence, that the entire rebellion was her idea rather than his." As the torchlight processions continued their winding dance through Tyre's ancient streets, Marcus found himself facing a crisis that went far beyond military strategy or political calculation. The child who had promised to be his empress had indeed returned, but as the architect of his greatest challenge and the counselor to his most dangerous enemy. Tomorrow would bring Alexander of Tyre to the city, and with him the woman who had once been a brave little girl named Lydia. After all these years, time had indeed ripened what fate had sown, but in ways that neither of them could have anticipated when promises were made beside the ashes of a conquered village. Marcus slept little that night, his mind churning with implications that transformed every aspect of the rebellion he faced. By dawn, he had formulated a plan that was equal parts desperate gamble and calculated strategy. If Lydia truly held such influence over Alexander, then reaching her might accomplish more than any military campaign. The morning brought festival preparations that transformed Tyre into a stage worthy of kings. Banners bearing Alexander's eagle hung alongside the ancient symbols of Phoenician commerce, while merchants arranged their finest goods in displays designed to impress the visiting sovereign. The entire city hummed with nervous energy as citizens prepared to receive their self-proclaimed king. The advance riders report Alexander's column approaching. Phoenicus informed Marcus as they shared a simple breakfast overlooking the harbor. Perhaps 500 soldiers, plus his personal retinue. He should arrive by midday. Marcus nodded, his attention focused on final details of the plan he had spent the sleepless night refining. "I need access to the reception ceremony. Close enough to observe, but positioned where I won't be immediately recognized." "That can be arranged." The Merchant Council has prepared presentations for visiting dignitaries. I can include you among the trade representatives. Phoenicus paused, studying his guest's face carefully. May I ask what you hope to accomplish? Alexander may be growing eccentric, but he is not foolish. Attempting anything aggressive would likely prove suicidal. I seek understanding, not violence, Marcus replied, which was largely true if incomplete. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to discover you need not fight him at all. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself studying every detail of Tyre's arrangements with the eye of a soldier evaluating potential battlefield conditions. The main square where Alexander would receive the city's tribute was surrounded by buildings that could serve as observation posts or escape routes if circumstances required rapid departure. The harbor provided alternative transportation if overland retreat became impossible. More importantly, he noted the positioning of Alexander's advance guard, professional soldiers who maintained proper formation and discipline despite the festive atmosphere. These were not the ragged militia he might have expected from a provincial rebellion, but veterans who understood their business. Alexander commanded genuine military talent, which made the political solution Marcus sought both more necessary and more challenging to achieve. Near noon, the sound of approaching horses and marching feet announced the rebel king's arrival. Marcus positioned himself among the merchant representatives, wearing the sort of expensive but understated clothing that would mark him as prosperous but not remarkable. A hood pulled forward shadowed his features while allowing clear observation of the ceremony unfolding before him. Alexander of Tyre rode through the city gates, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, his presence commanding attention without apparent effort. He wore armor that combined traditional Roman design with Eastern decorative elements, bronze plates polished to mirror brightness, a purple cloak that proclaimed royal status, and a golden circlet that stopped just short of an actual crown. The man radiated confidence and authority in equal measure, but it was the woman riding beside him who captured Marcus's complete attention. Even after 25 years, he would have recognized her anywhere. Lydia had grown into the remarkable beauty her childhood promise had suggested, but more than physical grace marked her presence. She sat her mount with natural authority, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with intelligent assessment of faces, moods, and potential threats. She wore robes of deep blue silk that proclaimed high station without ostentatious display, her hair arranged in the elaborate style favored by Eastern nobility. Gold bracelets caught the sunlight as she gestured toward various points of interest within the city, clearly briefing Alexander on important details. Her voice, when it reached Marcus across the square, carried the educated accent of someone equally comfortable in multiple languages and cultures. The formal presentations proceeded with the elaborate courtesy that Eastern diplomacy required. Phoenicus stepped forward to welcome the visiting king, offering the traditional gifts of salt, bread, and wine that symbolized Tyre's hospitality. Alexander received these offerings with appropriate dignity, though Marcus noticed how frequently his gaze turned to Lydia for subtle guidance on proper responses. Citizens of Tyre, Alexander addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Your city has always been a jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean, a place where cultures meet and prosper through mutual respect. Under the new order we establish, Tyre will continue to flourish as it has for centuries, free to pursue commerce and craft, without interference from distant rulers who know nothing of your customs. It was a skillfully crafted speech that acknowledged local pride while promoting Alexander's message of independence. Marcus noted how carefully the rebel king avoided direct criticism of Rome, focusing instead on positive promises for the future. Such restraint suggested either political wisdom or Lydia's moderating influence. When Alexander finished speaking, Lydia rose to address the crowd in her own right, an unusual privilege that underscored her unique position within the rebel hierarchy. "People of Tyre," she began, her voice warm but carrying unmistakable authority. You have shown wisdom in choosing prosperity over ideology, commerce over conquest. The future we build together will honor the best traditions of East and West while creating new possibilities for those bold enough to embrace change. Her words carried conviction that went beyond mere political rhetoric. Marcus found himself studying her expressions, searching for traces of the child who had approached him with such brave certainty years ago. The faith was still there, but tempered now by adult understanding of complexity and consequence. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus faced the crucial decision point his plan required. He could retreat safely to his lodgings and report what he had learned to his advisors. Alternatively, he could attempt direct contact with Lydia, gambling everything on the hope that childhood promises might bridge the chasm of adult conflicts. The choice was made for him when Lydia's gaze swept across the merchant representatives and stopped, her eyes meeting his with sudden recognition. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, they looked at each other across 25 years and a square filled with people who had no idea they were witnessing the reunion of destinies. Then Lydia turned away, speaking quietly to Alexander before stepping down from the ceremonial platform. She moved through the crowd with apparent casualness, pausing to speak with various dignitaries and merchants while gradually working her way toward Marcus's position. "Gaius Maximus, is it not?" she said when she finally reached him, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "A merchant seeking new opportunities in changed times." "Indeed, my lady," Marcus replied, matching her tone and formal manner. "Though I confess, I find myself uncertain which opportunities might prove most profitable. Perhaps we might discuss potential ventures in a more private setting. I maintain chambers in the palace that would be suitable for business negotiations." The invitation was clearly more than commercial, but Marcus could not determine whether it represented opportunity or trap. Lydia's expression revealed nothing of her thoughts or intentions. She had learned to school her features in the years since childhood. "I would be honored by such a meeting," he replied. "Excellent. Present yourself at the palace gates at sunset. My guards will escort you to appropriate quarters." She paused, then added with the slightest emphasis, "Come alone, as befits a private business discussion." As Lydia moved away to continue her public duties, Marcus found his heart beating with an intensity he had not experienced since his first battle. Everything now depended on whether the woman she had become still remembered. The promises made by the child she had been, the afternoon, passed with agonizing slowness as Marcus prepared for an encounter that might determine not only his personal fate but the future of the eastern provinces. He reviewed possible approaches, considered various scenarios, and tried to anticipate how she might respond to his revelation of identity. As sunset approached, Marcus made his way through Tyre's winding streets toward the palace complex that Alexander had appropriated for his court. The building showed signs of recent renovation, Roman architectural elements blended with Eastern decorative motifs in a style that proclaimed the new order's ambitious scope. The guards who met him at the gate were clearly elite troops, professional soldiers whose disciplined bearing and quality equipment marked them as Alexander's personal bodyguard. They escorted him through corridors lined with tapestries and artwork that represented a fusion of cultures, past chambers where he glimpsed officials engaged in the administrative work that kept even rebel kingdoms functioning. Finally, they delivered him to a private apartment overlooking the harbor, where oil lamps cast warm light across furnishings that combined luxury with practical comfort. Lydia waited alone, having exchanged her formal robes for simpler garments that somehow made her appear more formidable rather than less. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair beside a low table set with wine and delicacies. "We have much to discuss, and I suspect we both prefer honesty to diplomatic pretense." Marcus settled into the offered seat, studying her face for any sign of the emotions she must be feeling. "Then let us speak plainly, Lydia of Antioch. Though I suspect that is not the name you were born with." "No," she replied simply. I was born Lydia, of no particular importance, daughter of a village scribe who died when Roman legions put down a minor rebellion. I became Lydia of Antioch through choice and circumstance, advisor to kings through merit and opportunity. And the little girl who promised to be an empress? She learned that some promises can only be kept by changing their meaning. Lydia poured wine for both of them, her movements graceful and controlled. Tell me, Marcus Aurelius Severan, do you remember what you told that child when she made her bold declaration? I told her to wait. That time must ripen what fate has sown. Indeed. And have you considered that perhaps time has ripened exactly as fate intended, but not in the way either of us expected? She raised her cup in a gesture that might have been toast or challenge. The question now is whether two adults can find wisdom that eluded the child and the emperor who made promises they could not keep. As the first stars appeared over Tyre's harbor, Marcus found himself facing the most critical negotiation of his reign, not with Alexander of Tyre, but with the woman who had shaped both their destinies in ways neither could have foreseen. The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was certain could bear their weight. Marcus found himself studying Lydia's face in the lamplight, searching for traces of the child who had once approached him with such fearless conviction. She was there in the direct gaze that met his without flinching, in the tilt of her chin that proclaimed courage, unchanged by years of complexity. You planned this, he said finally. The rebellion, Alexander's rise, all of it orchestrated to bring us to this moment. Lydia sipped her wine thoughtfully before responding. I planted seeds, but Alexander chose to water them. I offered counsel, but he decided to act upon it. Men like to believe they shape their own destinies, even when following roads others have carefully mapped. And what destination did you map for him? For us, justice, she replied simply. Though I confess the path has proven more complex than my younger self anticipated. Marcus leaned forward, drawn despite himself by the passion that suddenly animated her features. Justice for whom? The eastern provinces that now suffer under taxation heavier than Rome ever imposed? The soldiers who die in battles that serve one man's ambition? Justice for a 10-year-old girl whose family was killed by Roman soldiers pursuing rebels they never found? Lydia's voice remained steady, but Marcus caught the flash of old pain in her eyes. Justice for the countless people who have been treated as resources to be exploited rather than citizens to be served. The revelation struck him like a physical blow. In all his years of pondering their childhood encounter, he had never considered what had brought her to that burning village in the first place. Now the pieces fell into a darker pattern, not chance, but tragedy that had shaped a brilliant child into a woman who would orchestrate the rebellion of half an empire. You blame Rome for your family's death. I blamed Rome for many things once. Now I understand that empires are not evil by nature. They simply grow so large that they forget the individual human cost of their decisions. She set down her cup and stood, moving to the window that overlooked Tyre's bustling harbor. Tell me, Marcus, when you decided to campaign in the eastern provinces, did you consider the families that would be displaced? The children who would lose their parents to your wars? Marcus followed her to the window, standing close enough to catch the subtle scent of the eastern spices that perfumed her hair. Every general weighs such costs, but sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices. Greater good for whom? She asked, turning to face him directly. For Rome? For the empire's stability? Or for the people who must live with the consequences of those difficult choices? Her questions cut to the heart of doubts that had plagued him throughout the campaign. How many villages like the one where they had first met bore the scars of Roman authority? How many children had lost families to wars fought in service of imperial unity? What alternative do you offer? He asked. Alexander's kingdom has brought its own suffering. Higher taxes, disrupted trade, the uncertainty that comes with political upheaval. Alexander is not the destination. He is merely the path. Lydia moved closer, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like dark stars. What I offer is the possibility that two people who once made impossible promises might find a way to keep them through wisdom rather than force. The child promised to be an empress. The woman has made herself counselor to my enemy, and the emperor promised to wait for time to ripen what fate had sown. Perhaps he should consider that the ripening is complete. The weight of her words hung between them, carrying implications that went far beyond personal reunion. Marcus understood now that this conversation would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of the Eastern territories and potentially the empire itself. "What do you propose?" he asked quietly. Lydia smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth he had seen from her since their reunion. "A partnership that neither Rome nor the rebellion expected. You command the loyalty of legions. I have the trust of the Eastern peoples. Together, we might create something better than either empire or independence could offer alone. You speak of treason. Against everything I have sworn to defend. I speak of transformation that serves the people rather than abstract principles." She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. "The child who promised to be your empress has become a woman who can deliver the eastern provinces to Rome, not through conquest, but through marriage." Marcus felt his heart stop, then resume beating with painful intensity. Marriage, a political alliance that becomes personal devotion. Roman authority married to Eastern wisdom. The emperor's justice tempered by understanding of local needs and customs. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The promise kept, but in a way that serves peace rather than ambition." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Lydia's expression shifted instantly from intimate negotiation to alert wariness. "Alexander," she said quietly. "He grows suspicious when I am absent too long from his side." The door opened without ceremony, and the rebel king himself entered with the confidence of a man in his own domain. Alexander of Tyre entered the chamber with the easy stride of a man accustomed to command. But Marcus noticed how his eyes immediately assessed the scene before him, the intimate positioning near the window, the tension in Lydia's posture, the careful distance his advisor had suddenly placed between herself and their mysterious merchant guest. "Lydia," Alexander said with forced casualness, "I trust your business negotiations prove fruitful." "Indeed," she replied smoothly, moving to pour wine for the newly arrived king. "Gaius Maximus offers interesting perspectives on trade opportunities between East and West." Alexander accepted the cup, but kept his attention focused on Marcus, who maintained the bearing of a prosperous merchant, while his mind raced through rapidly shifting possibilities. Recognition flickered in the rebel king's eyes, not of identity, but of something that troubled his instincts. "Tell me." "Gaius Maximus," Alexander said, settling into the chair Marcus had vacated. "What brings a Western merchant so far from familiar markets? These are uncertain times for traders with Roman connections. Uncertainty often creates the greatest opportunities for those bold enough to seize them," Marcus replied carefully. "Political changes frequently disrupt old arrangements while opening paths to new ones." "Spoken like a true merchant," Alexander observed, though his tone carried subtle challenge. "Yet something about you seems familiar. Have we met before?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Marcus understood that his disguise was failing under the scrutiny of a man whose survival had depended on reading people accurately. Yet retreat was impossible. Lydia's proposal had opened possibilities that might render military conflict unnecessary. "I have one of those faces," Marcus said with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to deception. "Merchants often resemble each other after enough years traveling the same roads." Alexander laughed, but the sound carried no warmth. "Perhaps. Though I confess I am curious about a merchant who travels with only 6 guards through territories where bandits prey upon Roman traders." "Either you are very poor or very confident in your protection," Lydia intervened smoothly. "Alexander, surely our guest's security arrangements are his own concern. We were discussing more pleasant matters, the future of trade relationships between your territories and Western markets." Of course, Alexander agreed, though his gaze never left Marcus's face. And what conclusions have you reached about such relationships? Marcus felt the weight of decisions settling upon him like armor before battle. Every instinct warned that his disguise was compromised, that Alexander's suspicions would soon crystallize into dangerous certainty. Yet Lydia's proposal offered an alternative to the bloodshed that conventional warfare would surely bring. I believe, Marcus said carefully, that lasting prosperity requires partners who understand each other's true value rather than relying on deception or force. Truth in partnership, Alexander mused. An admirable principle. Perhaps you would favor us with complete honesty about your own identity and intentions. The challenge was direct, leaving no room for further evasion. Marcus glanced at Lydia, seeing in her eyes both encouragement and warning. Whatever happened next would determine whether their childhood promise could be kept through wisdom or would be buried beneath the weight of adult conflicts. Very well, Marcus said, standing slowly and allowing his merchant's posture to shift into the bearing of a man accustomed to imperial authority. I'm Marcus Aurelius Severan, Emperor of Rome. I came here seeking understanding rather than conquest. Alexander's reaction was swift and predictable. He leaped to his feet with his hand moving instinctively toward his sword hilt. Yet he stopped short of drawing the weapon, perhaps recognizing that violence in this moment would serve no one's interests. The Emperor of Rome, Alexander said slowly, sits in my capital as my guest, having deceived his way into my presence. I came under diplomatic immunity as a merchant seeking negotiation, Marcus replied firmly. No deception was intended regarding my peaceful intentions. Peaceful intentions. Alexander's voice rose dangerously. You bring legions to my borders and call it peaceful? I brought legions to restore order. I came personally to seek understanding. Marcus gestured toward Lydia. Your advisor has shown me possibilities I had not considered, alternatives to warfare that might serve both our peoples better than continued conflict. Alexander's gaze shifted between Marcus and Lydia, and understanding dawned in his eyes with terrible clarity. You know each other. This entire meeting was arranged. We met years ago, Lydia said quietly, as child and emperor, when promises were made that circumstances have finally allowed us to honor. What promises? Alexander demanded. That time would ripen what fate had sown, Marcus answered. That a little girl's faith in the future might prove wiser than adult calculations of power and politics. Alexander stared at them both, comprehension warring with betrayal in his expression. You would abandon our cause? Everything we have built together. I would transform it into something greater, Lydia replied. A partnership that preserves what you have achieved while ending the bloodshed that serves no one's true interests. The rebel king stood silent for a long moment, his hand still resting on his sword hilt as he weighed options that would determine the fate of kingdoms. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the bitter wisdom of a man who had learned that even victory could taste like defeat. Then let us hear this proposal that would make emperors of merchants and merchants of kings. The negotiations that followed extended deep into the night. Three remarkable individuals reshaping the map of the ancient world through words rather than warfare. Alexander proved himself as astute a diplomat as he was a military commander, extracting concessions that preserved both his dignity and his people's prosperity while acknowledging the practical reality of Roman power. The agreement they crafted was unprecedented in its scope and vision. Alexander would retain authority over the eastern territories as a client king, but under a framework that granted substantial autonomy while maintaining nominal Roman oversight. Trade relationships would be formalized through treaties that benefited both East and West, while military cooperation would replace the costly rebellions that had drained resources from both sides. Most remarkably, the marriage between Marcus and Lydia would serve as both personal union and political symbol. The emperor's justice, tempered by Eastern wisdom, Roman authority softened by understanding of local customs and needs. Alexander would serve as the first governor of the unified eastern provinces. His rebellion transformed into the foundation for a new model of imperial governance. "It is not the independence I originally sought," Alexander admitted as dawn light began filtering through the chamber's windows. "But perhaps it achieves the same goals through wiser means." "The best victories," Marcus replied, "are those where former enemies become partners in building something better than either could achieve alone." 3 months later, the wedding of Emperor Marcus Aurelius Severan and Lydia of Antioch took place in a ceremony that blended Roman tradition with Eastern customs. The venue was the great amphitheater of Damascus, rebuilt and rededicated as a symbol of the new partnership between East and West. Representatives from across the empire attended, witnessing vows that carried both personal and political significance. Marcus stood at the altar wearing imperial purple combined with Eastern silk, while Lydia approached in robes that incorporated both Roman white and the deep blue favored by Eastern nobility. The ceremony itself was conducted by both Roman priests and Eastern religious leaders, acknowledging the diverse traditions that would be united through their marriage. As they exchanged vows, Marcus thought of the wooden horse that still sat on his desk, the gift from a refugee child whose simple faith had reminded him of promises that transcended political calculation. Young Lydia from the refugee camp was among the honored guests, her eyes bright with the wonder of witnessing the fulfillment of impossible dreams. "Do you, Marcus Aurelius Severan, take this woman to be your partner in all things, to govern with justice tempered by mercy, to lead with strength softened by wisdom?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice carrying across the vast amphitheater. "And I promise to honor not only the woman she has become, but the child whose courage first captured my heart. To you, Lydia of Antioch, take this man to be your partner in all things, to counsel him with honesty, to stand beside him in times of trial, to help him serve the people with both strength and compassion." "I do," Lydia answered, her own voice clear and strong. "And I promise to help him remember that true emperors serve their people rather than ruling them." The years that followed proved the wisdom of their unconventional solution. The eastern provinces flourished under the new arrangement, their prosperity funding infrastructure projects that benefited the entire empire. Alexander proved himself an exceptional administrator, his knowledge of local customs and languages making him invaluable in managing the complex relationships that held the diverse territories together. Marcus and Lydia's partnership extended beyond the personal into every aspect of governance. Her understanding of Eastern cultures helped shape policies that addressed local concerns while maintaining imperial unity. His military experience and Roman legal training provided the framework within which her innovations could flourish. They had 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter who grew up speaking multiple languages and understanding that leadership meant service rather than domination. The eldest son would eventually succeed Marcus as emperor, bringing to the throne a perspective shaped by both Roman discipline and Eastern wisdom. On quiet evenings, when the day's imperial duties were complete, Marcus and Lydia would often sit together in their private chambers, watching the sunset paint the sky above their capital in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they would speak of the future, of the empire they were reshaping together, of the legacy they hoped to leave for their children. But sometimes they would remember a burning village and a small girl's impossible promise, marveling at the strange paths fate had chosen to fulfill the hopes of 2 people who had dared to believe that some dreams were worth waiting for. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked one evening as they watched their youngest child play in the garden below their window. "The path we chose, the compromises we made." Lydia smiled, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "I regret the years we lost, the pain that brought us together. But I cannot regret the destination fate chose for us, even though you never became an empress in the way you imagined as a child." "I became something better," she replied, turning to face him with eyes that still held traces of the fearless girl who had once approached an emperor without hesitation. I became a partner to a man wise enough to honor promises made to children, and together we built something greater than either empire or rebellion could have achieved alone. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above their peaceful city, Marcus reflected on the strange wisdom of a 10-year-old girl who had understood, perhaps better than any adult, that some promises were worth keeping regardless of how impossible they seemed. Time had indeed ripened what fate had sown, transforming a child's innocent faith into the foundation for a new kind of empire, one built on partnership rather than conquest, on understanding rather than force. The wooden horse still sat on his desk, joined now by the clay figure their refugee friend had made, two simple toys that reminded him daily that the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from discovering that former opponents could become allies in building a better future for all. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that love, when given time to ripen, could indeed transform the world.